People Making Money. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we are here every Wednesday at 12:30 p.m. Pacific Time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and then, as I always say, an hour in for Mountain and Central Time. And we talk about all the things related to financial success. So for the last few weeks, I've been talking about various issues related to starting and having a business. Talked about business entities, ways you can find financing, some of the fastest ways to get started in a business. Other times we talk about job hunting and various issues related to going to a meeting to discuss a job, et cetera, et cetera. Today, I'm going to go on to a little bit different topic that relates not necessarily to making money per se, but what do you do with the money once you've made it? And how do you prepare for a time when perhaps eventually you won't be working, i.e. retirement? So I feel compelled to say this because it doesn't get discussed very often. But the idea of retirement is actually a pretty new concept. Most people in history never retired. They could never accumulate enough wealth that would allow them to live and not work. So if you think about maybe 150, 200 years ago, when we lived in a much more class stratified society, so you had the very wealthy, or in Europe, we might have called them, the aristocratic or the upper class. So they had inherited wealth from generation to generation to generation to generation. And very much until perhaps the 19th century, the 1800s, it was considered a bad thing to work. So you wanted to be a gentleman of leisure. And of course, women of that class for sure did not work. Even during the 1800s, it was very, very unusual for a woman of the upper class to work. So, men spent their time conferring with, their estate manager, perhaps. That was about as much work as they did. Other than that, they might get involved in scientific work, writing, politics, something like that. But they would not have had a profession. They would not have had a business. That is not what the upper class did. They were retired from birth in many ways. And women spent their time making calls, visiting each other, perhaps doing charitable work, and in some very limited cases, they might have done some writing or scientific work. That was pretty unusual as well. And by the way, probably the best portrayal that I've ever seen of the transition of the upper class is Downton Abbey. I'm a bit of a Downton Abbey, lover, I guess you would call it. And if you're interested in that, by all means, if you have not seen it, it's a wonderfully done show, the original show, and what's nice is it is pretty historically accurate. Of course, there's dramatized to it to make it more interesting, but going back several hundred years, you had the upper class or the aristocracy, and then you had the lower class. You had, the serfs or the poor. And of course, they never retired. It was not possible. They worked until they died. And then in between, there was always kind of a merchant class, what we would now call the middle class, okay, in between the upper class and the lower class, or the very wealthy and the sort of perpetually poor. But that was a very small segment of society, and rarely did they get to the point where they could accumulate enough money where they didn't have to work. Although the goal, especially as you moved forward into the 1700s, was to, and into the 1800s, even more so, was to acquire enough money to buy themselves into the upper class. Okay, so a lot of the families that are in the upper class did not start there. Okay, I mean, of course, there was no sort of, nobody if you go back a couple thousand years, there was just people, right? So it was through wealth, influence, power, so that an upper class developed. Um, and so if you were middle class and you could make enough money through business or whatever you were doing, typically through business, some sort of commerce, then you might join the upper class. You might buy a title. You might be able to convince the crown, for example, in England, the king or the queen, to sort of grant you some sort of landed estate, perhaps for service to the sovereign, to the king or queen. And in that way, you joined the upper class. Although people who joined the upper class oftentimes didn't become complete, people of leisure because they were used to working, right? So retirement is more of a modern day idea, really kind of post World War II almost. So maybe about 75 years. And the ability to retire came largely from the fact that the post-World War II years, the post-World War decades, 50s, 60s, were a decade of tremendous ability for people in the United States to create wealth. That was one part of it. And by then, labor unions had become strong enough and that they were able to negotiate for pension plans that allowed even middle class workers to retire. And so we might call the World War II generation, the so-called greatest generation, many of them are able to retire because by then the systems were in place whereby they could accumulate enough wealth that they didn't have to work. As well, the idea of a sort of mandatory retirement age grew, typically around 65. And part of that was, I think, and I don't know this historically, so this is just me guessing now, but it seems to me that there was a desire by younger people to sort of get the older people out, number one. Number two, when you only had so many top positions, so then nobody could move up unless these people were forced to move on. And so that system of retiring people, you may have heard, like, after 30 years, you get a pension and a gold watch, and, off you go into retirement, right? So that became a fairly common thing for several decades. But despite that, people in the lower economic strata, they never retired. They never did. They could never accumulate enough money to retire. So now here we sit in the contemporary United States, and on the one hand, in some ways, it's getting harder to retire. Life is more expensive. And on the other hand, the ability for anyone to accumulate wealth, or maybe not anyone, literally anyone, but the broadened ability for people in this country to accumulate wealth is such that functionally most people, if they work hard, plan judiciously, can probably acquire enough money to be able to retire. Now, of course, it depends what kind of lifestyle that you want to lead when you retire. And so when you think about that, I think the first question to answer is, what do I want retirement to look like? What am I going to do? Who's going to be in my life when I retire? These sort of very basic questions. So retirement is not solely a financial function, okay? There are other aspects. So I remember when my mother first retired after working, most of her adult life, she was bored out of her head. She just couldn't. She actually went back to work for a while. I think it was at a garden store or something. And then she didn't like that. And eventually she sort of found all these things to do. And she made a lot of friends who were retired, and she traveled. And so she built herself a life. But I think in the beginning, her idea was, oh, thank goodness I don't have to, go to work every day anymore, and life is going to be great. That is typically not the case. Many people who stop working end up getting depressed, even clinically depressed, and losing a sense of purpose, losing their purpose and a sense of mission in their life. So, again, I think the first step in deciding about retirement is, what do I want my retirement to look like? So I know for myself, I don't think I'll ever completely retire in the sense of, become literally a man of leisure, if you will. I like talking to people about business. I like helping them establish their careers, build their businesses. I get a lot of enjoyment out of that. It's part of my purpose in life, and so I just don't see myself ever completely retiring in the way, say, my mother did, devoting her time to travel and fixing up her house and those kind of things. This is not to criticize her at all. Everybody should figure out their own path. The key thing is, what will you enjoy? What will make your life full, right? In the same way that we talk about that during the earlier phases of our life, the same thing happens in retirement. And I've spoken to many people who say, I don't ever want to retire. I love what I do, and I don't ever want to stop. So I think, just as I think I've talked about this before. 50 years ago and earlier, the rails within which we lived our lives were much more set. Right. I was having this conversation with somebody yesterday. I was saying, when I was heading into college, I already knew I was going to college. I was getting married. I was having children. Right. That is what you did. That was my generation. Right. That is not the case anymore today. And it makes life much more difficult. We have to really figure out, what does success mean to each of us individually? What is our individual definition of it? What do we want to do with our lives? Okay, and our society, our culture, is nowhere near as directive of us as it used to be, and so that's a very difficult thing to figure out. It's really a matter of figuring out, what is my identity? Who am I? And what makes me tick? And what will help me to feel I'm living a life well lived. So I'm coming back now to the financial aspects of retirement. If part of the plan is to not work or to dramatically scale back how much you work, then the reality is you're going to have some financial resources to do that. It's inescapable, right? So how do we do that? What does that entail? So today I'm going to talk about just a few basic concepts of retirement plans, retirement accounts, however you want to term that, and just to give you a brief overview. Now, I feel compelled to say this because it's the world we live in. Nothing that I'm saying today is meant to be specific advice for any individual. This is general information for you to consider. Your specific situation, I have no idea what it is. I can't even begin to comment on it. So nothing I'm saying is targeted for you as an individual. This is information for you to think about, hopefully learn more and more, and consult with your financial professionals about what you should do for your specific case. Okay, that's crucially important. Just like each one of us has to have our own definition of what is success and what will help us to live a fulfilling life, what each of us needs to do for our financial well-being is very individualized. Okay, so what may be the right decision for me would not by any means be necessarily the right decision for you. Okay, so I put together just a real short PowerPoint. So let me, wow, let's see. I'm not sure. This is, open system preferences. Well, okay, let's see. Use my pad. There we go. Oh, well, okay. Something happened with Zoom. All right, so you know what? I'm just gonna talk about it then. Unfortunately, you won't be able to see the slides that I put together. So you know that, but if you want, you'll find my email address, my contact information in the show notes. I'll be happy to send you a copy of the presentation. So if you were seeing it in front of you right now, you would see kind of a green field of wheat, very sort of you know, calm looking picture that says retirement accounts. And you know, as I often do, I start out by talking about the 3 pillars of attainment. That's this graphic back here. And as we always do, we're talking in the pursuits pillar and the finances realm. So you know, finances is not just working or having a business. It's really the full gamut. So when you think about finances, we think about investments, we think about insurance, all of the, you know, finances in a very broadly defined way. And so that's what I'm doing today is approaching that topic, you know, more broadly than I have in the past. Okay, so bring the slide here. Okay, so all right, so the first concept is there are 2 fundamental types of retirement plans or retirement accounts. There's something called a defined benefit account, and there's something called a defined contribution account. Now, in their names is the way that they worked. Or that they work, I should say, not past tense, the way that they work, okay? So a defined benefit plan or a defined benefit pension is a pension where the amount of money that the recipient receives is set, okay? And the unknowns are how much money has to be put in, or the unknown is how much money has to be put into the plan in order for that beneficiary, that pensioner, the person receiving the money from the pension, so that they can get the amount of money that's been defined for them. Okay. So for example, a defined benefit pension, the benefit might be $2,000 a month. Okay. So then the open question is, how much money needs to be in the plan in order for it to pay $2,000 a month for whatever the term of the plan is, typically the life of the beneficiary. Okay, I'm going to use the term beneficiary, pensioner, or plan beneficiary. All those mean the same thing. It's the person receiving the money from the plan, from the pension. Okay, that's a defined benefit pension. Okay, the other type is a defined contribution plan. Now, in a defined contribution plan, we know up front how much is being paid in. And oftentimes, defined contribution plans have a set amount that's paid in each month. Okay? And so we know that already. What we don't know is when the beneficiary starts withdrawing money or getting payments from that pension, we don't know how much they're going to get. That's unknown. Okay, we can make some projections, but we don't know until we actually start taking money out. And it typically will vary over the life of the plan. Okay, so you can see that in a defined benefit pension, okay, the risk is on the person who has to contribute the money, because the pensioner is getting what they're getting has already been set, and that's it. Okay. In a defined contribution pension, okay, the risk is on the beneficiary. Okay. Whoever is paying in the money, whether it's the beneficiary himself or whether it's the company he works for or whatever, they know this is what I put in periodically each month or whatever the period is. The person receiving the money, the pensioner, he's not going to know how much he's going to get because it's going to vary depending on how well the money is invested, what kind of inflation there is, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so let's talk about where you typically see these pensions these days. So when I was a kid, almost all pensions were defined benefit pensions. That's why that's why so many people of my parents' generation could retire. And that's why they stayed at companies for so long. So if someone started working for a company, let's say at 25 years old, okay, typically among the benefits that company paid was a pension, and it was a defined benefit pension. So the person knew, if I work for this company until retirement, I'm going to be able to retire and get a certain amount of money each month for the rest of my life. Okay. Now, that's a terrific benefit, or it sounds like a terrific benefit, but keep in mind, in a way, it trapped people into working for the company, because a lot of times if you left, you gave up that pension. Okay. So until your pension benefits vested, meaning you owned them, if you left the company, that's it, you got zero. Okay. And the vesting periods could be long. Right? It could take 20 years for you to vest in your pension plan. Okay, so if you worked there 15 years and you were really unhappy, but hey, you hung in there for another 5 years in order to get that pension because you didn't want to give that up, because typically there was a trade-off between how much salary you got versus the pension benefits that you got. So to get great pension benefits, typically you accepted kind of a lower lifestyle during the time when the pension was building up, right? And that's what allowed that system to work. The other thing that allowed it to work was there was a growing workforce. So companies were able to fund those pensions because they were growing, the economy was growing, and there were more and more people sort of paying in benefits to these pensions relative to the number of people who were taking their benefits from the pension. Okay. Now, as our birth rate declined and the rate of employment increase slowed, it became harder and harder for companies to maintain those kind of pension plans. And so what happened was they started converting to defined contribution plans. And I remember as a teenager, I think this started kind of in the 70s. Maybe it started earlier than that, but I first remember hearing about it in the 1970s. So you would hear about automobile manufacturers negotiating with unions, and one of the big issues was pension benefits, because of course the unions wanted to maintain defined benefit pensions for their members. And the car companies that were struggling at the time with competition from Japan and Germany, as well as their own mismanagement, they were finding it harder and harder and harder to pay these pension benefits. And the pension plans were chronically underfunded, meaning they weren't putting in enough money into them in order to actually be able to pay those benefits. So they were heading for a huge crisis. And there were cases where pension plans essentially went broke, and the pensioners, after working all that time, got little, if any, benefits from them. So the whole system was completely out of whack. And so in order to avoid that in the future, companies shifted to a defined contribution plan. And initially, they might contribute money to it every month, or they might deduct money from the employee's salary and contribute it to the pension plan each month, or a combination. If the employee put in $100, they might match $100. There were all kinds of different ways of doing it like that. But what that did is it shifted the burden of the pension, or not the burden, the risk of the pension off of the company and onto the employees. As I talked about a few minutes ago, in a defined contribution pension, the contributors know how much money they're obligated to put in. What we don't know is how much in benefits the beneficiary is going to get out when the beneficiary retires. Okay? So that's been a huge shift in private company pensions over the last 40 or 50 years, to where we are today. Okay, so where we are today is very, very few private companies offer defined benefit pensions. Okay, I would imagine in the automobile industry, there are still employees who are getting benefits from them who retired, years ago. As far as I know, even in a highly unionized field like automobile manufacturing, I don't think workers there get defined benefit pensions anymore. They may. I'm not 100% sure. But in most other places in the private sector, and for that matter, in the nonprofit sector, people do not get defined benefit pensions anymore. They typically will have a defined contribution pension. So where do we see defined benefit pensions nowadays? Two main places. Well, actually, it's one main place, one great big main place. Most governments still have defined benefit pensions. Okay, so the federal government, state governments, and to the extent that local governments have pensions for their employees, they still tend to be defined benefit pensions. And if you follow the news on these things, you will hear periodically about how many states' pension plans are underfunded or dramatically underfunded. So you might have heard of CalPERS. So CalPERS is the California Public Employees Pension Fund. And I read periodically that, either because they had a bad year and now all of a sudden they're underfunded, or maybe it's a perpetual underfunding, but the benefits promised to beneficiaries in these public sector pensions is typically outstripping the amount of money that have been paid into these pensions. And so they're either going to have to borrow to meet their obligations, or they're going to have to raise taxes to meet them, or they're going to have to, default on some of their pension obligations. It's not really clear to me what's going to happen. What I can tell you is that most defined benefit pensions are now for people who work for various government entities. So, for example, I was in the Navy for many years, and people always ask me, "Oh, well, so you got a pension, right?" Because a military pension is a great pension. It's a defined benefit pension. I say, "No, I didn't get one." Okay, I started too late, and the only way I could get into the Navy was by acknowledging that they did not have to let me stay for the minimum 20 years it took to qualify for a pension, in essence, for pension benefits to vest. It's not legally vesting in the government the way it is in the private sector. Doesn't really matter. But the bottom line is, I was not permitted to stay for 20 years. And so they knew going in they weren't going to have to pay me a pension. Now that's just me. For most people who join the military, they join young enough that they can stay for 20 years if they want to and get a pension. Now, it was I want to say about 5 years ago, the military moved to a defined contribution model, because what the Department of Defense figured out was ever more of their funding was going for retiree benefits. And they didn't have the money they needed for current military personnel, along with equipment and all the stuff they need. So they shifted the model about 5 years ago, and I was at the midpoint in that shift, and I had the option of going one way or the other. For me, it really didn't matter. I wasn't getting a pension no matter what. But for younger people who joined the military a few years ago, they are now getting a defined benefit pension. And in many ways, it's a benefit to them, because most people who join the military don't stay for anything close to 20 years. I think the average length of duty in the military is around 5 years. So for most of the people who join the military now with a defined contribution pension, they will walk away with at least a small pension that they own because it's defined contribution, whereas before they would have walked away with nothing. And unlike this situation, private pensions, there was no reduction in pay to offset the defined contribution pension. Pay kept at its regular pace, and this was an added benefit put on top. So I don't know if other sectors of the government are going in that direction, but suffice it to say, in the world today, unless you work for a government entity, it's very unlikely that you are going to get a defined benefit pension. So the pension that most of us are going to have is a defined contribution pension, or some kind of defined contribution retirement plan. Okay. And that really means that in many ways, we're going to direct how that works. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time then is what are called defined contribution plans. And I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to talk about two to give you an idea of kind of the very basics of how they work. Okay, so over the years, if you've heard people talking about retirement plans, you may have heard of a 401k, a 403b, a TIO, a SEP IRA. There's all kinds of plans out there. Okay, but they really come down to two basic types. And they have to do with when the money goes in, and how the money grows, and and what happens when you access the money. Okay. And so I'm just going to use two that provide a very basic example. One is the traditional IRA, and the other is a Roth IRA. Now, you may have heard of both of those. Okay, the Roth IRA is the newer of the two. Okay, and the IRA, not the Irish Republican Army, okay, the individual retirement account, which is sort of the term for defined contribution retirement plans. Okay, individual retirement account. It's an account that's owned by the individual from the get-go. Okay. And that's one of the things that makes it so good is if you have an IRA, you're no longer bound to your employer. If you want to leave, you can, and you're not going to lose typically any of your IRA benefits, because they're personal to you, they're individual to you. Okay. Now, there are defined contribution plans especially where the employer makes a matching contribution, that kind of thing. Sometimes you have to be with the company for a certain period of time before they'll do the matching, and you have to stay for a certain number of years before it vests in you. I'm not going to get into those right now. Those are complications, and there's all kinds of permutations in those things. But what we're going to talk about for the rest of the time here, again, is a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA. Okay. Now, in a traditional IRA, okay, you you are contributing before tax dollars, meaning the money going in hasn't had income tax paid on it yet. Okay? And sometimes those payments may be a deductible expense on your income tax. Okay? Now that's great because you're investing in pre-tax dollars, which means they haven't been shrunk by whatever income tax you're paying. Okay? And then once it's in the IRA, it grows tax-free. Or, well, let me rephrase that. It grows tax deferred. There's really no such thing as tax-free, as you might imagine. Okay? It grows tax deferred, which means let's just say, for the sake of example, you have $1,000 in your IRA. Okay? And over the next year, you make a return of 10%. So you make $100 on it. Now, that $100 will not be taxed as part of your income that year. Okay? But it's not going to escape taxation forever. It's not tax-free. It's just when you pay taxes is deferred, put off to the future. Okay? And the reason that's good is, so starting at the beginning of the second year, you now have $1,100 earning a return, as opposed to if you had to pay taxes on it. Let's say you're at a 25% tax bracket, so you only have $1,075 earning a return. And you say, oh, $25 is no big deal. Well, it may not be in the beginning, but as it builds up and builds up, so let's say you have $100,000 in the account, and that year it earns 10%. That's $10,000. So at the end of the year, I have $110,000. If you had to pay taxes on it, you'd only have $107,500. So you have another $2,500 in the account that continues to earn a return. So the tax deferred nature of how the account builds its value is a great aspect of an IRA. That's why, one of the reasons why they're so popular. Okay, I mentioned that you own it. That's one reason they're so popular. Another is the tax deferred earning power of an IRA. Okay, and then what happens is you can typically start taking money out when you are 59 and a half years old. Okay? You don't have to, but you may. If you take it out before 59 and a half years old, you'll pay a penalty. I believe it's 10%, but don't quote me on that. Okay? So that's... Oh, Siri. Siri's going to correct me. Thank you. And then there's an age at which it's mandatory for you to start taking payments. Okay. And I had the figure in my head now. I dropped it. I figured 69, 72, somewhere around there. If you haven't started taking withdrawals from your IRA by then, you will get penalized for not doing so because the government does want its taxes. Okay. Now, on a traditional IRA, everything you take out is taxable. Since you never paid taxes on the money you invested in it, when you take it out, the principal is taxable. And of course, the money you earned on it, the return, whether it's interest, dividends, whatever it was invested in, we'll talk about that next week, whatever it was invested in, that return is taxable as well. Okay? So all of it is taxable. So you see, you don't escape paying taxes on the money you invested in the IRA. You just put it off. And the idea is when you're in your peak earning years, you're paying taxes at a higher rate than you will when you retire. And so the idea is you'll end up paying less taxes by waiting to pay the taxes at the point where you retire. That's the idea behind it. Okay. Whether that's true for any individual or not, that'll depend on your circumstances. Okay. But that is the idea behind it. Okay, so that's a traditional IRA. Okay, and there are limits on the amount of money that each year that you can put in a traditional IRA, and I think they just changed. The Congress increases them periodically. Okay, they were $5,000 for a while, then they were $6,000. I think I read recently they were increased, but I could be wrong about that. But in any event, there is a limit to what you can put into them. Okay, and once you've reached that limit, then you have to find something else to do. And there are other things you can do to save for retirement that may have the tax deferred benefit to them. It's just the IRA is only usable up to a certain level. Okay. So then you have the Roth IRA. So the Roth IRA is more recent, although it's still been around for quite a long time now. The difference for the Roth IRA is generally the money you're investing in the Roth IRA is after-tax dollars. So you've already paid tax on that money, and then you put it into the Roth IRA. Okay? Once it's in the Roth IRA, like with the traditional IRA, it grows tax-free. Okay? So you still get the benefit of earning a return on all of the return from the previous periods. Okay? And it builds up and builds up and builds up, hopefully. And then, again, the youngest is at 59 and a half years old. You can start withdrawing money from it. Okay? And again, like with the traditional IRA, if you withdraw money prior to 59 and a half, okay, you'll pay a penalty. Now, by the way, there are exceptions. If you withdraw money for certain reasons, you may not have to pay penalties. Okay, so if you withdraw money for like surgery, life-saving surgery or something, I believe you don't have to pay the penalties. Okay, so there are some limited number of reasons when you can withdraw before 59 and a half where you won't pay penalties, but in general you're going to pay penalties if you withdraw money for both of them before 59 and a half. Once you hit 59 and a half, you can withdraw money. Now, the difference with the Roth IRA, since you've already paid taxes on the principal, when you withdraw principal, you don't have to pay taxes because you already did. So you're only going to pay money on the return, the amount of money accumulated over and above the principal paid in. So let's say when you retire, you have a Roth IRA that's worth $500,000. Okay, that's the value of the Roth IRA. Okay, and let's further say that of the $500,000, $200,000 of it, maybe you were very young when you started it, $200,000 of it was money you contributed that you've already paid taxes on. So you're only going to pay taxes on the $300,000 that's accumulated over and above the principal. Now, contrast that with the traditional IRA, where because the $200,000 you contributed was contributed before taxes, you haven't paid taxes on it yet. Okay, so the entire $500,000 will be taxable when you withdraw. Now, I'm not saying you have to withdraw it in a lump sum. I'm just saying that no portion of the $500,000 will ever not be taxed. Okay, whereas with the Roth IRA, when you get to the point where you start withdrawing principal, you're going to be able to withdraw that and not pay taxes on it because you already did. Okay. Now, retirement plans, defined contribution retirement plans, tend to act like either a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA. Okay, that's why I just did these two basic categories. And I can't tell you which one is right for you or which one is right for you at any given time. There are opportunities to convert a traditional to a Roth, as I understand. Okay, these are all issues to discuss with your financial services professional. Okay, the key thing is to understand the main differences so you can ask questions. Okay, because it may be early on in your career you have a very low tax rate. Okay, and maybe it's actually going to be lower than what it would be when you retire, you're thinking, or something like that. I don't know. All of these things should be discussed, worked out, considered before a decision is made as to what type of retirement plan you set up. Okay, and your financial professional will be able to help you with that. That's their job. Okay. Okay, and by the way, it may not be the specific person, your specific, but they will get the information for you from, the experts, because these rules change periodically, right? There'll be a new tax bill, they'll tweak this rule, they'll tweak that rule, and frankly, it takes a lot of time and effort to keep up with all the changes. Okay, and so that's why you want to have someone advising you on these kind of issues, so you make sure you're getting the best information possible. And by the way, when I say financial professional, it could be your accountant. Maybe you have a lawyer who deals with these things. Maybe you have a financial services professional. Any of these people should be qualified to help you with this. But, I highly recommend that you talk to them before making any of these decisions, unless you know the information yourself, in which case, why are you watching this? Right, to try and see if I made any mistakes, so then you can let me know. I get it. It's fine. So that's the real basics of retirement accounts. Okay, and again, I'm going to repeat what I said in the beginning. The best thing you can do is engage in making decisions about this issue as early as possible. Okay, even if you're not able to put away much money, and maybe you're young, you're just starting out, you're not making a whole lot of money, but even if you can just put aside a little bit on a periodic basis, that's much better than waiting till you're an old guy like me to start a pension. All right, because it takes so much time. So you might have heard of the rule of 72. Okay, so the rule of 72 is take the rate of return you're making on an investment and divide 72 by that rate of return, and that will tell you how long it will take for your money to double. Okay, so if you're getting a 1% return on your investment, it's going to take you 72 divided by 1, or 72 years, in order for the money to double. If you're getting a 6% return, okay, and right now the 10-year treasury is at 4, okay, so 6% should be very doable. Okay, so if you invest your money at 6%, 72 divided by 6 is 12. So it'll take 12 years to double your money. Okay, and if you can get a 12% return, which again, it's certainly possible in the investment environment today. Okay, so 72 divided by 12 is 6, which means every 6 years your money will double, right? And that's how to make your money work for you. That's the benefit of saving your money. And that's what will allow you to accumulate enough money to where you can meet your financial goals, whether it's complete retirement, whether it's being able to have money to supplement so you don't have to work as much as you did before, or something like whatever it is, whatever you decide you want to do. Okay, the main thing is plan ahead so you have the financial resources that you need. Okay, I'm just going to take a look at my slides real quickly to make sure I covered everything I wanted to. Let's see. Yes. Yep. It's interesting. One of the slides dropped off. Okay. Well, so the only other slide I had in there was where you can go to ask questions. Okay, and that'll be in the show notes. All the contact information that I mentioned will be in the show notes. So just to review one last time, 2 basic types of pension: defined benefit pension, defined contribution pension. These days, defined benefit pension probably only if you're working for a government entity. Okay, maybe some legacy like automobile manufacturing and places like that. Defined contribution pension, probably what you're going to have. Okay, and basically two types of defined contribution pensions. One is in sort of a traditional IRA where you're contributing pre-tax dollars, the money grows tax-free, and then when you withdraw it, everything you withdraw is taxable. And then the Roth IRA, where the money you contribute is contributed on an after-tax basis. You've already paid taxes on the contributions, and then it grows tax-free, or tax-deferred, I should say. And then when you take the money out, the growth is taxed, but the principal is not taxed because you already paid taxes on it. So those are real basic concepts for you to know in starting to figure out your retirement, your financial needs for your retirement or for the later years of your life, your work slowing down period. So that's what I have for you today. Next week, I'm going to talk about various types of investments, because when it comes to putting money in for retirement, there's lots of different places you can invest the money. And so we should know some of the basics of that as well. So tune in next week on Wednesday at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern time, an hour in for Mountain and Central time, right? And we will continue on the Way to Wow show, People Making Money, as we work toward meeting our financial goals. And with that said, I just want to mention, I do have some really great guests booked coming up in a few weeks. Very excited for you to meet them and hear their stories. So stay tuned for that. And also, I have a second show now. It's on Tuesdays at 10:30. It's a half-hour show. It's called The Way to Wow, Business Lessons from the Military. So I invite you to tune in for that show. And if you can't tune in live, then you can always go to our YouTube channel, The Way to Wow show on YouTube. And all of our episodes are there from the first 3 seasons of the show. We're now in season 4 for People Making Money. We're in season 1 for Business Lessons from the Military. So I invite you to check those out. And as always, if you have something you want to learn about, or if you know someone you think would make an interesting guest, by all means, do contact me. I'd be happy to talk to you or your associate, and perhaps we'll have them on as a guest. And that just leaves me to say, as I always do in sign off, to my dear friend who was such an inspiration to me, Marie, darling, you are and ever will be my belle. Thank you very much for watching, and look forward to seeing you next week.